So, game one. Yeah, just a funny few quotes just before we start. In Deep Thinking, Garry says as a commentary to this whole match that he said, as a believer in chess as a form of psychological, not just intellectual warfare, playing against something with no psyche was troubling from the start. And reminded me a lot actually of something from the AlphaGo movie. If you haven't seen it, you've got to watch it. AlphaGo, the story of essentially of Deep Blue in the game of Go. So this was DeepMind with its AlphaGo taking on Lee Sedol, one of the finest Go players ever. And but of course, you know, in that movie, AlphaGo was like way strong. It was like dropping you know, Leela from a couple of years ago against Garry all of a sudden out of nowhere. It was that sort of effect, but still, it was man against machine, and somehow the man was still expecting to win. But there's a great guy who got involved with DeepMind. He played a match first of all against AlphaGo and then helped them build it up for the match against Lee Sedol. A lovely guy called Feng-hsiung that Natasha and I met actually at. We gave a little bit of there was a sort of a group discussion together, and a lovely guy. But he describes what it's like playing against a machine. I think it was absolutely perfect. He said, with a human, when you play, you have an exchange by feeling. So I look at you, I know, okay, you know, maybe you want to talk with me, maybe you fear me. You know, I can feel many things. But with AlphaGo, you can feel nothing. And when you feel nothing when you play, you have more questions about yourself. At the start, you think, okay, my move is good, really good. And then all of a sudden, oh my God, bad, terrible. Oh, why did I play here? You know, that sort of thing. And yeah, I thought that was very powerful way of describing how it is. You've got to hear how he says it himself, much better than I do. But yeah, you know, very interesting psychology to playing against an engine. So Deep Blue was white in game one, the 1996 Philadelphia match, and played 1e4, and Garry played c5. Yeah, the Deep Blue guys, they were wondering whether Garry really would play his Sicilian, but Joel Benjamin thought really that yeah, absolutely, Garry's very disciplined in his opening choices, he'll play the Sicilian. Very different, of course, in 1997, 1 year later. And now c3, and Shu said in Behind Deep Blue that said Joel only had a couple of months to prepare Deep Blue's opening book, so he chose to play less travelled lines. And you know, the first, when you hear of it, you think a couple of months to prepare a book. You know, come on, you know, you can do better than the C3 Sicilian. But yeah, you know, when you start to think of it, you start to realise that probably a couple of months was not very much indeed. I mean, well, working at large companies, normally it takes 3 or 4 weeks before you get your badge in order to be able to do anything. And also, you know, I'm pretty sure that you know, back in 1996, that first match, there weren't any nice tools really in order for you know, Joel to test out the openings. I imagine it was just like a text console, and that was it really. So probably quite difficult to do, and also I think, you know, quite a new experience in general, just to prepare an engine's openings against Garry, you know. And so yeah, it must have been pretty difficult to do that. So in actual fact, yeah, you know, for that first match, Deep Blue's openings were not really that impressive, which kind of makes, you know, the score that it achieved, you know, even more creditable. And yeah, I mean, after c3, Garry played a little surprise actually. People were expecting him to play more something, I guess maybe like knight f6, keep the position just a little more closed. But Garry played d5, but that was actually quite a decent choice. I mean, you have the tendency to get sort of IQP positions, which yeah, you know, weren't necessarily the best for an engine of that time to handle. So d4, knight f6, knight f3, bishop g4, bishop e2, e6, and h3. Very natural move there, just to give the question to the bishop, and also just for free, you know, get an escape square for the king when you castle later. So bishop h5, and now castles. Now, very interesting to run this past the other engines, because they come up with something, well, with a number of very interesting things here. And it's perhaps actually, you know, when AlphaGo played Lee Sedol, you know, it was playing quite some amazing strategy for Go. And then when AlphaZero played Stockfish 8. Again, AlphaZero was coming up with all sorts of amazing stuff, and that's the stuff that really grabbed you as a player, I think, and really made you sit up and take notice. Yeah, Deep Blue was playing a lot more normally, partly because I think the influence of human opening books was also quite heavy, and because you know, in this position it just played the very normal castle kingside, whereas you know, if you put this position on Dragon or on Stockfish, then they're coming up with some very interesting ideas. One of the ideas that they came up with was to go c4, queen d8, and then this pawn sacrifice d5. So takes, knight takes d5, and castles. Actually, kind of reminiscent a little bit of AlphaZero against Stockfish 8 and the Queen's Indians, where AlphaZero was just playing d5, giving up a central pawn, opening lines, and then going for it. And this is actually quite interesting, quite scary, I think, for a human player. Obviously, the engines cope with it fine, but, well, you know, there's pins and various worries. So that would have been a very interesting line. Just to finish it off, castles, knight c3, knight takes was the idea. The idea is if rook takes d7, then knight e2 check. B takes c3, queen e6, takes, bishop c4, queen b6, queen c2. You know, white's got, you know, decent compensation for the pawn, plenty of open lines, likelihood that you'll somehow pick up this bishop, get the two bishops. Black's fine as well, but definitely a very interesting line there to just to giving away a pawn like that. Well, Deep Blue played castles, knight c6, and bishop e3, and now c takes d4 from Garry, and well, knight takes d4 would have been pretty boring. But c takes d4 was played by Deep Blue. So isolated queen's pawn, you know, in some ways a very nice isolated queen's pawn for black, because this bishop is outside the pawn chain, so you get the chance to swap off the light squared bishops, and you know, the light squared bishop is the bishop that defends the weak light squares around this isolated queen's pawn. So in general, that's very positive. However, you know, the fact that the light square bishop is on the king's side, possibly getting exchanged, and not on the queen's side, means that the queen side light squares are somewhat weaker. There's no light squared bishop, you know, sort of cutting across the centre, pointing towards the king. And there's always the chance to gain tempi, for example, you know, with discovered knight e5 or g4, gain tempi against that bishop. So yeah, it swings and roundabouts. In principle, it's a very good thing positionally for black to have. But you know, there are tactical opportunities. So here Kasparov played not a novelty, but very unusual, and still never been as popular as the main move bishop e7, knight c3, queen d6. You know, which is pretty solid. Been lots and lots of games with that. White goes queen b3, black goes castles. If you take on b7, I can pin you and then take on b2 afterwards. And yeah, I mean, basically, black's sort of doing fine there, but just a complicated position. Bishop b4 gives black the opportunity to take on c3. That happened in game 3. If white goes knight c3, but also gives the possibility to put the bishop round a5 to b6. So yeah, you know, very decent idea. So a3 played, bishop a5, and now knight c3. There was a game, Wojciechowski against Neverov in 1994 that went b4, bishop b6, knight c3, queen d8, knight a4, knight d5. That was the game, and you know, black was doing absolutely fine there. So well, Deep Blue played knight c3, and after queen d6, well, interesting moment here. Deep Blue played knight b5. And Feng-hsiung in his Behind Deep Blue, he points out that actually Deep Blue didn't like the white positions, always thought that it was slightly worse with that isolated queen's pawn. So the big, you know, sort of drawback to playing these lines as white was that yeah, Deep Blue was quite willing to go for repetitions. So it's quite possible that if Garry had done something like queen d5, for example, Deep Blue might just have gone knight c3, which would have been an interesting start to the match somehow. But yeah, obviously, you know, Garry didn't particularly know that. Yeah, you know, Garry had to think about a possibility. Now, he got criticised a fair amount for his move queen e7, and well, either queen b8 or queen d8 was recommended. I think that what Garry was nervous about in those positions was, for example, if you play a move like queen b8, then white can play the move d5. And if knight takes d5, we go bishop c5, and we've got threats of knight d6. Now, this is supposed to be okay for black. You can go bishop b6 here, knight d6, king f8. There's no really dangerous discovered attack. So we play b4, takes and takes, and you know, white's just got quite nice compensation for the pawn with a nice knight on d6, king on f8, pawn on b7 to attack. But black, in principle, is fine. The other idea is, you know, queen d8, we can go d5 and bishop c5, which is pretty similar. You go knight e4 as black, attacking the bishop and covering d6, and then we go b4, you know, knight c5, bc5, castles, knight d6. Again, you know, nice knight on d6, queen takes d5 possible, knight takes b7 possible. Yeah, some decent compensation for white. So I mean, I think that was really what Garry was worried about, and I think, you know, that's also one of the things you do notice with the contemporary comments, that yeah, you know, very much tending to play down the resources that Deep Blue had in its position and might have found as well, you know, and very much tending to say, oh well, you know, Garry could have played just this, but you know, he did something strange. But I'm pretty sure that Garry was, you know, sort of thinking, ooh, you know, I don't want to allow anything like that, and that's why he played the move queen e7, which of course keeps a track of the c5 square. I mean, it's also a nice ambitious move. You know, you're keeping d8 free for a rook to attack the pawn, and you're aiming to play bishop b6. It's just that it gets a little bit awkward after bishop g5. You know, it's a bit hard to get out of that pin with the dark square bishop on the queen side. You know, so yeah, you know, there was a little bit of a risk to it, but yeah, I'm pretty sure that was the reason. By the way, the engines are still looking at playing the move d5 here. E takes d5, knight b5, queen e7, and now rook c1, looking to play bishop c5. So, you know, even though, again, trying to reinforce this idea. And then bishop b6 takes, knight d4. This was what they were looking at. This was the line that the engines were looking at, you know, with, well, you know, kind of just an equal sort of position. Black's a pawn up, but weak pawns. You'll, yeah, you know, you'll probably put a knight on d4, eventually get your king into the centre. Yeah, you know, just a balanced position, really, nothing amazing. But interesting how, you know, how much the engines are looking at, you know, quick d5 and just freeing the pieces like that. So after knight b5, queen e7, Deep Blue played knight e5, and this is, you know, very typical. It's what we were saying, really, that, you know, this bishop on h5, it gives black the opportunity to swap off the light square bishop. So you're thinking, okay, in general, I've done a good thing. Isolated queen's pawn on d4, swapped off a piece that defends the light squares around it, great. But of course, you know, white's got some pressure here. You know, the knight's putting some pressure on c6. We might have bishop g5 later, pressure on f6. There's some dynamic things for black to work out, and yeah, I mean, that is in general, that's I mean, really what Deep Blue is looking for. Deep Blue is, yeah, a pretty dynamic engine, simply, as you know, engines have nowadays have become. So I mean, I think, you know, from that point of view, Deep Blue was so much a taster of what was to come. But I think you would have needed a lot of imagination to see into the future what engines would become in order to really appreciate it. I certainly didn't have that imagination at the time. So castles from Garry, rook c1, and now rook ac8, which is not a bad move, but it would have been a little bit more cautious to play rook fc8. The point being that after a move like bishop g5, you can just play h6 here. And if bishop f6, well, it gives you the possibility of playing queen f6, and there's no knight d7 forking a rook and a queen. It's not, you know, 100% clear, because, you know, very often the engines are just taking on f6 with the pawn anyway, just doing that. But Rook fc8 would have maybe been a little bit more cautious there. But rook ac8 is okay, but it just gives white this possibility of bishop g5. And, well, you know, you can sort of say, well, knight b5 was a funny move, but you look at how white's pieces are now nicely coordinating together, and yeah, actually quite nice, really. You know, and there's also this idea of going knight g4, this step back, hitting the knight on f6 there, and giving black double pawns on the king side. So actually you would say that although maybe the position's objectively equal, if yeah, if one player is making the running, it's definitely deep blue here. So yeah, little I'd say, you know, early advantage to deep blue here. So bishop b6, and now bishop takes f6 from deep blue, and this is the start of a lovely two-move sequence that really gives it a nice clear advantage there. I mean, Gary's idea was that after knight g4, I just play knight takes d4 here, takes and takes, and yeah, protecting the pawn on f6. If you go something like rook d1 to attack it, I can even throw in h6 first just to get rid of that piece, or I can just go rook fd8. And nothing much happening for white there. But bishop f6 played. Obviously queen f6 allows knight d7, so Garry has to take his first set of double pawns. And now this very nice move, knight c4. Yeah, definitely one of Deep Blue's nicest moves, actually, in the whole match, because it's the sort of thing you can miss very easily. With knight c4, there's just one little tactic in there. The idea is that if takes. Now that you've forced g takes f6, you've got queen g4, forking the king and the bishop. And well, actually, what you're aiming to do is just to take the bishop on b6 and give black another set of double pawns. And that indeed happened after rook fd8. Takes and takes, and I mean, one of the very nice things about giving black these double pawns on here is that this knight becomes invulnerable. You know, it was played here on move 13. You wouldn't have thought really that that knight would stay there on b5 for much longer. It was bound to get chased away, or you're going to capture on c6 and the knight would get hit. But no, now it's on b5, and there's nothing that can drive it away because the queenside pawns have been doubled. And you know, in principle, Gary's position is not bad. But you know, the engines do feel that white is definitely the one that's made progress here. So 0.44 according to Stockfish, slight advantage, you know, and actually very good opening play from Deep Blue. So here, now I mean, what you often see with Deep Blue's moves, you know, when you run them past the modern engines, is that you know, very often the moves that Deep Blue are playing are not the engine's first move. But they're very often moves that the engine sort of says, well, okay, yeah, you can do that too. You know, so it's maybe not the most accurate move according to the engines, but they're always good moves. And sometimes you even get, you know, it's a move that the engines wouldn't have played, but that seems to have a similar evaluation to what they did. So yeah, you know, Deep Blue's play is quite impressive at times, it must be said. You know, it really is, even from a modern engine perspective. But here the engines want to throw in queen g4 check before they play rook d1. And the idea is that when you do play something like f5, we can put the queen on f4, which is a very nice square. You know, it's covering some dark squares there, defending the pawn, and also threatening a move like d5, you know, loosening this pawn. And, well, this was the engine main line, actually. d5 here, rook d8, not taking the pawn, allowing d6, queen f6, and then rook d2. And yeah, I mean, the engines thought that white had a slight advantage here. Yeah, I mean, complicated position this, but this pawn on d6 is pretty strong, as long as you're careful that, you know, black doesn't develop some sort of e5 and then knight d4 thing and, you know, really break things up. But yeah, you know, you're just sort of likely to be attacking weak pawns for the rest of your life, really. After e5, you know, we'll go queen e3 and hit b6, for example, you know, and yeah, I mean, I think this would be not necessarily a very easy position for a human player to play there. So I like very much this move, queen g4 check, just coming to f4. What Deep Blue did was a little bit less incisive, so played rook fd1, and now Garry played f5, which is engine approved, and the idea, it just stops queen g4 to f4 with tempo, and you're preparing to bring your queen into f6. But Deep Blue had a very nice idea here, just played the move queen e3 in this position. Pardon me. also connecting with the dark squares in that way, and actually aiming for the b6 pawn, with the idea that it played afterwards queen f6. It played here the move d5. Now the Engines were actually looking at playing something like rook c4 in this position, just with the idea of playing this idea d5 later, but also then maybe just bringing the rook over to f4 to attack the pawn. It's strange how they're gravitating to that f4 square in front of that doubled f pawn, either with the queen or with the rook. But Deep Blue played much more cleanly. Just played the move d5. Rook takes d5 from Garry, a good idea in actual fact. I mean, the point is after e takes d5, queen b6, the black rooks sort of feel a bit restricted behind, the pawn and the knight that's pinned to the queen. So, from that point of view, in terms of freeing your position, it makes much more sense to swap off a pair of rooks. And you've only got one rook tied down behind your position, and, well, that rook's always going to get more freedom than two rooks will. So if you took on b6 now, then queen b2 would be a little bit irritating. Would just start exchanging off bits. Would still be a little bit better for white, of course. But here Deep Blue just played the move b3, which I think was again a very nice move. Just shows Deep Blue going for the initiative, keeping its own pawn and looking to pick up blacks. Daniel King, both in his book and in his Power Play DVD series, or rather a video series, he said, "Isn't this a strange move, b3? A human would just have played b4 very naturally." And yeah, I agree. I mean, it's just the move that naturally comes into your mind. Sort of takes control of some squares, and if the knight moves away sometime, you might be able to play b4 to b5. Yeah, I mean, the point of b3, it might be to cover c4 against knight e5 to c4. It might be that the Deep Blue was thinking about playing a4 and consolidating that knight on b5 at some stage, and well, easier to do that if the pawn isn't hanging on b4. But indeed, that is a move that just strikes you as just a tiny bit odd there. But yeah, and here Garry had to make quite a crucial decision, and I think what maybe happened here a little bit was that Garry got a bit impressed with the way that the Engine was playing, the way that Deep Blue was playing, because the commentators wanted the move rook d8 in this position. Queen b6 and rook d7. Both Daniel King and Yasser Seirawan recommended rook d8 to d7, and it is pretty solid, really. I mean, white's got nicer pawns, of course, but black is pretty active. You've got ideas like f4, also d4. You're a bit worse, but it doesn't feel too bad for black. Now, what Garry did, in actual fact, is good. The Engines think that this is probably the black's best way to play. But it kind of shifted the game to something that got quite tactical. And, well, this was here Deep Blue started proving that when things get tactical, when it's a question of finding superb defences, then, yeah, the Engines, even ones from 1996, even baby ones that haven't been extant very long and whose software is a little bit ropey due to lack of time, they're still, still doing this sort of stuff fantastically. And well, that's what Garry sort of pushed the game towards, and that probably wasn't too sensible. But he played king h8, queen b6 and rook g8. So yeah, we've got some I can imagine why he was attracted to it, though, because he got some nice looking attacks. Queen g5 hitting c1 g2, also can also be played with a preliminary sack and then queen g5. So yeah, quite interesting. And you've also got moves like f4 to f3 as well, so it feels like there's danger. But Deep Blue started connecting up its pieces really nicely. Queen c5 was a very nice move there. And one of the things that that Natasha and I noticed when we did Game Changer and looking at AlphaZero's games was how concrete AlphaZero was in regrouping its pieces. Human players often wait until a piece is driven away from somewhere before bringing it back. You try and you've got that sort of ingrained thing that you should make the most of a piece on a certain outpost. You should force the opponent to make it retreat before moving it back. But Alpha Zero was very often just moving its piece back to reconnect to its position and move on to the next plan. And yeah, this is very much what Deep Blue is doing in this position. It's very impressive. Just plays the move Queen C5. So you're connecting up with the rook, so that means that Queen G5 is no longer a double attack against that. It's only attacking the pawn on G2. The Queen's also connecting with the D5 pawn, which will mean, which is, well, obviously attacking a pawn, but also going to defend the pawn on G2. So that's, again, beautifully combining attack and defense. And actually, on C5, the Queen's also connecting with the knight on D6, so getting that knight active. And of course, when you play Queen D5, the knight and Queen will also connect with the F7 pawn and with the F5 pawn. So, I mean, to be honest, you know, you're seeing all those arrows on the board, but I think that's a very good representation of the power of that move. I think it's a very, very fine move from Deep Blue. And again, very, what you'd now call a typical engine move, you know, and really beautifully showing how to connect the position together. So Deep Blue playing exceptionally well here. Yeah, Garry played a slightly strange move, I guess, in a way. Played the move D4, and Garry pinpointed it as his key mistake. Although the engines think that it's still sort of okay, this move. It's just that you're going to have to maybe change your plan around a little bit. F4 is what the engines wanted here. Well, Daniel King points out that if Queen D5, we go F3, G4, and then Queen H6. Forking these two, which is a very nice, powerful little idea. Yeah, Rook D1 is possible just to sidestep those threats. And then D4 from this is Stockfish Against Dragon, one of my games. Knight takes D4, we've got Rook D8, and if you go Knight D6, and Queen E6 is quite nice. Hitting H3, threatening F3, hitting B3. Actually, this was what was happening in a lot of engine games. You know, my engines were sacrificing the exchange as white, getting 2 pawns, and then playing this position. Yeah, it's if you had a bishop with white, imagine a lovely light squared bishop or dark squared bishop pointing towards the king. You might feel, yeah, reasonably optimistic. Here the knight's not so great, and there's loose pawns over here. So yeah, you know, basically this was ending in a draw. But it's, yeah, you know, sort of F4 was definitely the way to get some aggression on there. It's a very natural human move as well. So I wonder what Garry had missed there somehow, because it is a very natural move to play. He played D4, and yeah, Deep Blue played Knight D6. And yeah, again, very nice move. Just activating that knight, not waiting for anything to happen, just activating the pieces. And here Garry played the move F4, and now everyone was deeply shocked. Hard to imagine, really, but everyone was deeply shocked at Deep Blue's courage in playing this next move, Knight takes B7. Yasser, Seirawan and Maurice Ashley in the commentary were saying that Queen D5 was probably the best move, or the most human move. I mean, it attacks F7 and it sort of defends G2 and defends this diagonal, so that's the idea. In actual fact, Black does have quite a nice move in this position, which the engines point out, that's never been pointed out before. It's the move Rook G6. So it's quite nice. We're hitting this knight on D6. If you go Knight F7, I just go King G7, and hey presto, the knight on F7 is trapped. So that's quite a nice little idea. If you go Knight takes B7, well, I go F3 here, and after G4, then actually you've kind of blocked yourself. You don't have Queen H6 hitting Rook C1 and Pawn H3 anymore. So D3 is what the engines want, and the idea is if Queen D3, you just go H5 here, and you've distracted the Queen. And if you go something like Rook D1, we go Knight E5, and then we're going to get an H5 here. Yeah, it's very scary for white. I mean, obviously, you know, the engines can defend it for you, but yeah, this looks very, very dangerous indeed. And if you go Knight F5, then we go Rook G5 here. This was, yeah, a lot of engine games taking place in this. White has to go Rook C5 to cover the knight. and then queen e6 here. And yeah, I mean, this was basically sort of ending yeah, in a draw by repetition in the end. These games, black's completely fine, white's kind of completely tied up there. So this move rook g6 is really excellent, and very, very nice indeed. If you go knight e4, I go queen e7, hitting a3. Yeah, that's when you really maybe would have wanted the pawn on b4. And if b4, then f3, g3, queen e6, hitting the queen and the pawn. Takes, I go rook takes, and yeah, plenty of counterplay. Rook coming into e2, d pawn running, pretty nice really. So I think that objectively, Deep Blue's move knight b7 was definitely the best there. So Garry played knight e5 and now queen d5 from Deep Blue, and here we get the decisive mistake. But to be honest, it's already getting a little bit tough for a human player to get his head around what has to be done here. And I think yeah, I think Daniel King gives a line later, and I wonder whether that was the one that Garry missed somehow, because it's easy to miss, and yeah, otherwise it's sort of hard to explain why Garry did what he did. Garry played the move f3. Queen g5 is what the engines want, just teeing up f3 with that discovered attack there. And now knight d6 from the engines. What's the threat? Well, the threat is to go queen e5 check, queen e5, and knight f7. So yeah, if f3, simply queen e5 check, and takes, and Bob's your uncle. So what you do after knight d6, we play the move f6, just defending this this knight, and yeah, threatening f3. I mean, the key point is that you're threatening f3, and if queen e5 is no longer checked, so you could take on g2 with mate. So this was what the engines were doing. Rook c7. Now they're playing the move d3 with black. King f1, trying to get out of anything there. I mean, there's also the threat of d2 coming in here. So king f1, and now f3. Queen takes f3. Very nice move. If knight f3, we've got knight f7 check. So rook d8 now. Counter strike, hitting the knight on d6 whilst the queen is on prise. Queen takes d3. Threatening queen h7 checkmate, of course. So knight d3, takes, and g3, and or a4. And the engines thought that this was approximately equal. Yeah, rook and 3 pawns for the knight. Probably be a little bit more nervous as black, I think. Maybe, than I don't know. Yeah, maybe rook f8 here, and we're going to pick up this pawn. Now it looks like black is just doing fine here, but these are the kind of engine lines that that were being looked at. But you can sort of tell they're not really clear cut for a human. There's plenty of room for doubt and all of that. But I think, yeah, after knight d6, if you find this move f6, when queen takes c5 is no longer a check, so you can just deliver mate on g2. I think if you find that, then maybe you're you start to believe somehow. I mean, Garry played the move f3 here. And after g3, he played the move knight d3. Still actually very dangerous, but it's just falling short in all lines. And of course, who better than an engine like Deep Blue, calculating hundreds of millions of positions per second, to demonstrate that. Daniel King points out that if queen f4, which looks really strong, again, one of those double attacks on the rook and the king side, then there's simply rook c8 here, which is really, really strong. The big problem, of course, is rook c8. I've just got gf, and obviously with a pin you can't take on g3 there. So yeah, very, very strong indeed for white. Maybe that's what Garry missed. I don't know. Knight d3 feels a bit of a funny move. I mean, I think the idea, you've also got ideas. You're attacking here. You might have some ideas of knight f4 or whatever. But rook c7 was played here, and we're coming into f7. I mean, this is the real problem. There's a lot of counterplay happening now against the black king. So Garry played rook e8. Knight d6, again, very nice move there, bringing all the pieces into play. That's one thing, Garry, Deep Blue just combining the pieces beautifully there. So rook e1 check played, king h2, knight f2, and well, black's actually threatening checkmate here, so it looks quite dramatic, but knight f7 check is just enormous here. Yeah, if queen f7, then we just go queen d8 check. Obviously, If you took on f7 here, then I'd have rook h1 checkmate. But I can just arrange it so that after I can just get checks all the time. Check, check, rook f7, queen d5 check, and well, I take on f3 whenever I want, and just destroying the mate, and just a huge material advantage there. So king g7 played, knight g5 check, too many checks there, king h6, rook h7, and Garry resigned because after king g6 we go check there. And funnily enough, I was looking for mates and all that, but actually the simple knight f3 again destroys this mating net and leaves black with absolutely nothing. And yeah, white's going to win very soon after. And Garry resigned, and he said afterwards it was the best a machine had ever played against him. And yeah, Frederick Friedel described that you know, after that game, Garry just you know, sat on his bed, staring into the abyss, thinking, "Oh my goodness, you know, what if this machine is simply invincible? You know, it had played that well." You know, Garry was that worried about it, and yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think this is one of the best games that the Deep Blue played against Kasparov. You know, quite amazing when you think, you know, all the problems that they'd had putting the machine together, all the software done at the last moment, lots of stuff that they would have wanted to have done hadn't been done. But yeah, you know, just like that, Deep Blue playing a really beautiful game. You know, I'd be proud of that one. Definitely would be as white. My goodness. So there we are. It was 1-0 to Kasparov, and well, you know, interest in the match was just all of a sudden huge, really, because this was the first classical time control game that a world champion had lost to a computer, and well, all of a sudden the yeah, the result of the match seemed very much in doubt. So there we are. Hope you enjoyed that one. Join for the next video when we look at game 2.